Well, thank you, Paige, and hello, everyone. Listening to Adrian's bio, I was reminded that Adrian and I share a strong belief in education, and it's in that spirit that we joined forces for this webinar. Because of the spike in unemployment nationwide, we anticipate financial shortfalls in community associations as a likely outcome of our current COVID-19 situation. Both of us have been fielding questions by many anxious board members, and we're here to present choices and opportunities, and we want to prevent foolish or not well thought out board actions. We have many ideas and concepts to share with you today, so we'll be moving through the material rather quickly. But like Paige mentioned, this presentation will be recorded so you can listen to it again or share it with others who are interested. And we may pause every once in a while to ask for your feedback, and with everyone muted, the way to respond is to raise your hand by clicking the hands raised icon in your control panel that looks like the one you see on screen. So let's give this a try. Grab your mouse and click me a hands raised if you're ready for us to get going on the presentation. Okay, I'm scrolling up and down the list. Adrian, it looks like we've got a sharp group with us today. Okay, thank you all. I'm going to click your hands down. And Adrian, let's get started. They're all yours.
Thank you, Robert. As everyone knows, this is the first pandemic we've had in 100 years, so none of us have been through one before. And what we're experiencing, in addition to the health crisis, is an economic crisis that is caused by the entire nation having been shut down. And it's resulted in a 30 million being on unemployment, and there was more being laid off. In fact, there's announcements today in the news of huge layoffs, more large numbers being laid off by companies. So the economic crisis is here, and I saw from the poll that 50% of the attendees today expect that they will be impacted by it. 22% already have, another 50% expect it. So this is something that is timely for associations and being able to look at what are their options and how do they deal with what's coming at them. And we're not going to cover collection issues. Those have been covered by other webinars. We're going to look at what you can do with reserves. And in particular, three different action items, three different areas that you can use reserves. And one is conserving cash by pushing projects, reallocating cash by borrowing, and saving cash by with existing reserve project. So let's go to the next slide. We know that there are tough decisions because we've been getting a lot of questions. I've been getting a lot, and I know Robert has as well. And so there's some urgency to a lot of them, and how do they deal with these? How do they navigate? And what are their duties, fiduciary duties as directors? And how do they handle those duties? And we'll cover those issues. Going on, what we're assuming is that as boards, you've already looked at your economic, your budget, your bank balances, delinquencies, you've made projections, you're anticipating rising delinquencies and impacts on your cash flow. And you've made adjustments to your operating budget or expect that you will be doing that. That you're doing your best to maximize collections right now and communicating that to your membership, and that you're working with legal counsel to find out exactly what it is that you can and cannot do in dealing with the finances for the association. And this is where reserves come in as one of the options available to you, a last option, not a first option, on dealing with shortfalls in operational cash. So that's what we're going to look at, and dealing with how reserves can play a role in helping you cover those expenses. Let's go to the next slide. The board has dealing with their obligations as directors to pay their bills, and of course the impact on members with their existing budgets, and trying to figure out what to do, and how to handle this, balancing things out. And they can't be sure on exactly how best to approach things, but we can tell you how to safely deal with these issues. And that's where the Business Judgement Rule comes in. It protects boards of directors in their decision-making process. Boards are volunteers and nonprofit associations, and this is true nationwide on the Business Judgement Rule. And the boards can be free of personal liability for their decisions, even if they make wrong decisions that result in harm to the association, if they follow the 3 steps in the Business Judgement Rule. And these are the 3 elements. First, that boards act in good faith, in the best interests of their associations, and with due diligence, meaning that they ask questions. Now, the second 2 are fairly obvious, that you make decisions that you think are in the best interests of the association, and you investigate things. The question is, what is acting in good faith? And that is that your motives are correct. And a quick example I can give you is in the early 1990s, a large earthquake hit Southern California. One of the associations had to rebuild, hired a contractor to do it, and the contractor started with the work. Elections took place, new board came in, and decided, the board president, that they could find somebody who could do it cheaper. So in the best interest of the association, getting the cost down is a good thing for the association. What they did, though, was they forced the contractor out. They made it impossible for him to do his job and forced him out. He sued and he won and got a judgment in the millions. So that is the acting in good faith part. The board was not. It was acting in bad faith to accomplish then the next element, which is the best interest of association. So if boards follow these 3 elements, in good faith, best interest of the association, and with due diligence, they can make wrong decisions and not suffer any personal liability for making bad decisions. Hopefully they make good decisions, but there's some assurance here that if they follow this process, that they're going to be safe in the things that they do. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. So the first thing we're going to cover is how to conserve cash in your reserves, and I'll turn it over to Robert.
Fantastic. Thank you, Adrian. So step 1 in a time of scarcity is to gather the facts, like you mentioned, and then you need to start conserving. When an income stream is at risk, the first thing you should do is pretty simple. Stop spending money. So in the process of belt tightening, I think of the Hippocratic Oath in the medical field. Look around and make sure you're not causing any additional harm by your decisions. So let's talk about prioritizing reserve expenses. They are not all the same. So you can divide reserve expenses into 5 categories: inconsequential, reevaluate, obsolescence, protection, and catastrophic. So let me walk you through a few examples so you know what I mean. Let's start with inconsequential. They meet the definition of authorized reserve expenses in National Reserve Study standards, but in the big picture, they are relatively meaningless to the association. They can pass by. So I think of things like a water heater for a pool restroom building, not a big deal. Not a big deal if they don't have hot water to wash your hands when you're not even using the swimming pool at this point in time. Or repainting a rear stairwell. Again, no big deal. The opposite of critical. Many people living in the building probably don't even know they have a back stairwell. Then you get to reevaluate. You could also call it wait and see, or watch and see, watch and test. It could be a perimeter fence that's aging, but could be okay with a few minor repairs. It could be a floor in a utility room or a security room like pictured here. It needs to be done, but there's really no harm in waiting a bit longer. Wait and see, watch and see. And then you get to obsolescence. Obsolescence is about things going out of date, either technically or aesthetically. One example I'm showing here is a front entry sign that's dated and worn and overgrown. The problem here is that you've seen it so many times that you kind of no longer even see it. Only visitors really notice how out of date and weathered it is. Or it could be something significant, something that you and everyone sees every day, literally sees, like your main entry lobby. This is clearly an asset that gives an important first impression. And then you get to protection projects. These are the major scheduled maintenance projects that are done to protect something from further damage. Classic examples are painting, siding, or trim or fencing to protect the underlying material. Or another example is asphalt seal coating. Now notice the significant and expensive damage that happens when appropriate maintenance is not done. You can see this asphalt crumbling and failed. And that takes us to the last category, catastrophic. These are projects that you should do on time or even perhaps slightly early because the consequences of failure are so undesirable. It could be the old hot water heater, the sole source of hot water for an entire building. It's exactly the kind of thing you don't want to fail on a Friday afternoon right before a holiday weekend. Or it could be, like this pictured here, an old driveway gate opener. It's not the kind of thing you want to break and leave your driveway or roadway open for days while a new part is ordered and installation is scheduled. Basically, you don't want something that is going to cause more damage or hassle or inconvenience for your owners than it is avoidable.
Yeah, let me add to that. On these critical repairs that need to be made, I would add things that would cause property damage or injury to others, such as roof repairs, plumbing repairs that need to be made, and that if they're not made, they will lead to significant property damage to other units, to the common areas, and it could also lead to personal injury issues. So those fall into that category of things that cannot be put off, that are critical issues.
Right, things that unwind and just cause way more problems than you were hoping if you just were trying to defer it. Okay, so we have the blank list here. Now you need to decide which type of projects are candidates to be deferred. Which types are the ones that are okay to not do, where you just think, I'm just not going to spend the money. So it starts with inconsequential. Stop. Red means stop. Stop doing any projects that have little or no merit. Easy choice. Then you get to reevaluate. Check them out. Defer the ones that you can and perhaps do a minor repair where needed. For obsolescence, delay the minor ones, but do the major ones. Move forward cautiously, making sure you're only spending money where it has impact. Then you get to the projects where you should go ahead and do them. As Adrian was saying, the ones that are going to protect the building or the owners, green means go. Protection projects will save your association money in the big picture by spending the money now, and then those that have catastrophic impact, make sure you do those projects. Don't be foolish and invite trouble. We already have enough trouble floating around us nowadays. So here's an example of a client I've been working with. Here's their original graph of reserve expenses through the years, straight from their reserve study. See how they have two large expense years in the first 2 years, followed by a light third year. And they asked us for help, so we took a close look at what made up those 2 years of expenses. And what we found was that many could be delayed. We were able to push a few key projects from the first and second year into that third year. And for this association, we reduced their expenses over $235,000 in their first 2 years. Now, I want to be careful. We reduced their expenses in the first 2 years. None of those projects went away. All we did was delay them. They didn't save any money. They just got some necessary breathing room. Projects did not disappear. We just moved them around and helped their cash flow a little bit.
I noticed that one of that you had on that last slide was a flat roof replacement project that could be pushed. This is where, going to the next slide on the business judgment rule, if you're going to delay projects, large projects that could be considered critical, you want to do your due diligence. And the third element there of the 3 points characterized by due diligence, you don't want to just make that decision on your own and decide, oh, we're not going to do the roofs this year, we're going to save money. You want something to back up your decision. So you're going to want something in writing from a roofing consultant, somebody that has the authority to say to you, I've inspected your roof and it'll go another year. We could just do a little bit of patching and you can delay the project by a year. So it shows that you're acting in the best interest of the association and you've done your due diligence, and then you document. You want to make sure that you put that into the minutes, you have some kind of written documentation, a paper trail, so that if for some reason the roof were to fail 6 months into a rainy season, causing a lot of damage, and lawsuits start flying, you've got a defense. You've shown that you made a decision in good faith, best interest association, and you did your due diligence, and you've got a paper trail backing up showing that you did that. So going on to the next slide. So you looked at, Robert talked about how to conserve cash in the reserves by delaying some of the reserve projects that you had lined up. Step 2 is to look at reallocating cash. So Robert, what do you mean by reallocating cash?
Well, thanks, Adrian. We'll get here to the meat of today's material, and that's kind of why we sandwich it in between the other two easier topics. I'm going to talk about 3 ways to reallocate reserves. One is reducing contributions, suspending contributions, and actually taking funds out of the reserve fund. And from my point of view, I presume with a published budget that if an association isn't making a full year's worth of their reserve contributions, or not making the entire reserve contributions they told the owners they were making, from a practical level, those 2 are both borrowing. So added to the third one, for what I'm going to talk about here in this section of the program, I'm going to consider them all borrowing. So any restrictions or sensitivities an association has on borrowing from reserves are going to apply to all 3. Now, here's a profile of our reserve contribution recommendations across the entire association reserves client base. It's percent of recommended reserve contributions compared to total budget. And you can see that quite commonly we're recommending reserve contributions in the 25% range of total budget. Sometimes higher, of course, sometimes lower, but that brings us to why we commonly say that reserve contributions need to be in the range of 25% of total budget. So for today's presentation, let's presume reserve contributions are actually 25% of budget. That means that if an association reduces their reserve contributions to 20%, that leaves 5% that could be reallocated to operating to offset that 5% increase in delinquencies. And that's a nice little short-term solution. Or perhaps the association drops their reserve contributions 10% down to only 15% of total budget. That now makes 10% of budget available to be reallocated to the operating fund, kind of opening that pipeline, so nicely offsetting a 10% increase in delinquencies. Now that's a real opportunity. I'm not sure how much delinquencies are going to actually rise. I've heard a lot of estimates in the 10% range. So what we're presenting here today are ideas about things that you can do, and you've got opportunity if you're making strong reserve contributions. But I want to caution you, whatever you do, don't drop your reserve contributions below 10% of total budget. If your reserve contributions fall below 10% of total budget, that's going to put your FHA approval at risk. And another point I want to make is that the larger your reserve contributions are as a percentage of budget, the more margin you have to work with, the more margin you have for reserve contributions to help the operating budget. Now, here's a typical multi-year funding plan, smooth and uniform through the years, gradually rising with inflation. And here's what it looks like if you either reduce reserve contributions for a few months or entirely stop reserve contributions for a few months. This is a sweet opportunity to free up some cash flow for your association, just like I showed with the pie charts. For this association, it adds up to thousands of dollars that can go straight to the operating fund where they're needed. But like Adrian's been talking about, document it, keep good records. This might be a zero interest loan that you don't have to go to the bank or government to get, but it's still going to require good paperwork and it's going to require a payback plan. Remember, the roof still needs to be replaced and the reserve fund was counting on those contributions. But I want to point out something from National Reserve Study standards. Here's the 4 funding principles. As you can see, providing sufficient funds are paramount, and stability and evenly distributed are desirable. But note that fiscally responsible is also a principle, and it may be fiscally responsible to pay your insurance or utility bill next month and figure something else out when you have more time to pay for your roof replacement in 5 years. What I'm getting at is that even in National Reserve Study standards, sustainability of the association is paramount. So it may be fiscally responsible to temporarily reallocate some reserve contribution cash to give a lifeline to the operating budget. And with my background, that reminds me of the famous phrase from Gene Kranz, flight director for the Apollo 13 mission, when the astronauts had that problem with their spacecraft. He said, "Let's work the problem. Let's not make things worse by guessing." So let's not guess. Let's gather the facts, look at the numbers, just like Adrian counseled earlier. And just like I showed with the pie chart, where associations that are contributing a larger fraction of their budget towards reserves have more margin to work with, the same is true with the reserve fund itself. Associations that have been fully funding their reserves have a stronger reserve fund balance, just plain more cash in reserves. So you look at this chart of an association that's fully funding their reserves. The target fully funded balance is the blue bars, and their actual cash is the orange line. You can see that the orange line never drops very low. They have a margin they can tap. Now, generally, this is the cash balance that insulates their members from special assessments. So even in the years their reserve balance might drop more than they expected, it doesn't drop to a critical level. And that's the kind of margin that can help out when the operating fund is on the ropes. Now compare that, the same association, but now presuming they have a lower starting balance because they have been and continue to baseline fund their reserves. Baseline funding is when the goal is to just keep the reserves cash positive. For associations with this funding strategy, the cupboard is already pretty bare. There's not much reserve cash to borrow from. You can see that orange line is pretty consistently low. And that just reveals another consequence of having a weak reserve fund. It's just no margin. So keep in mind that the roof and all your other reserve projects haven't gone away. They still need to be done. So if you don't make all your 2020 budgeted reserve contributions, or if you grab and borrow a chunk of cash from the reserve fund, those funds will need to be repaid. You should expect future reserve contributions to increase. So if this was your original 2020 reserve funding plan, and if you reduced your reserve contributions in half from, as you can see, just over $200,000 in 2020 down to about $100,000, or if you borrowed $100,000 straight from the reserve fund, you should expect that those funds will need to be repaid in the future. It could be very simple, just a 12-month or 24-month special assessment payback, or in many cases, you may be able to minimize the impact of the borrowing by spreading the payback over many years like I show on this chart. Now I'm going to flip back and forth, look at the difference not only in the first year, but in years 2 through 30. You can see the difference low in the first year, but notice it's a little bit higher on all the remaining years. And go, whoops, back and forth, back and forth. You see how when you take money out, one way to do it is to pay it back over a lot of years. So give me a hands raised if you see that concept that you need to pay it back either in short term or maybe over a multi-year scenario. Hands raised? Great. Adrian, they're tracking. They're paying attention. We got a sharp group with us today. Okay, I'm going to click hands down and turn them back to you.
Okay, I want to talk about a couple of things on the borrowing. First of all, if you borrow straight from your reserves, most associations have their reserve monies tied up in certificates of deposit, and they may be long-term CDs. And for them to borrow, they need to break the CD in order to get the funds available, and they suffer penalties. So the other option, which you just went through, of delaying contributions, temporarily suspending or reducing contributions into reserves, is more likely what most associations will do. It gives them ready availability to cash, and their CDs that may be laddered are still waiting for them to hit, and then they become available. So it's a planning tool that helps them get through the process. Now, the borrowing aspect that you alluded to, by not contributing monies into the reserves, at least here in California, there's a split of opinion as to whether that's deemed borrowing or not. One side says, yes, you've already created a budget, you've published it to the membership, you've told them you're going to be putting X number of dollars in reserves. If you don't do it, then in effect you're borrowing from reserves. The other side says that's not exactly what the statute says. Statute says that once it's in the reserves, if you take it out of reserves to use it for short-term operational expenses, that's borrowing. That's the definition. So from a strictly legal point of view, the failing to put money into reserves would not be deemed borrowing, but I think as a practical matter it is.
Yeah, you got that. And people can't see me, but two hands here. Is it the practical side, the legal side, but you still need reserves to be able to do your reserve projects?
Yes. Yeah, and the practical basis for treating it as if you were borrowing it is that you want to be able to let the membership know why you're doing it, that you are doing it, the reason why, and then how you plan to repay that, because your reserves are going to come up short if you don't, and especially if they're using baseline funding. They don't make the contributions into reserves. They've already got a weak reserve fund, and then if something unexpected happens, they're going to be faced with a special assessment. And all of the litigation cases I've been involved in that involve reserves have all been underfunded reserves and an unexpected special assessment that had to be levied, and that resulted in lawsuits being filed. So this is where it's important on the business judgment rule that you are acting in good faith, best interest association. Make sure you document your due diligence and make sure you communicate it to the membership. And then that part of that is a plan on how you will put monies back into reserves. So let's go to the next slide. And so we've seen on conserving cash by delaying reserve expenditures, reallocating with the borrowing. So step 3 is saving cash. So Robert, what does that mean?
Thanks, Adrian. Well, this actually hit me when I was out walking early in this coronavirus crisis. I saw this, you see on screen, an association in my neighborhood painting the exterior of their association. I called the manager and found out that the painter was offering a discount if they went ahead with the project now instead of waiting until summertime. He had a crew that was available to get the job done. Now notice safe physical distancing. You can kind of see one person, but walking along, you can see they're all spread out. They're outdoors in fresh air, everyone wearing masks, all normal procedure. So they were able to very easily go ahead with this project. Project took 3 weeks instead of 2 because they were going to do it with a smaller crew, but the association didn't care about 3 weeks versus 2. They just liked the discount. And here's another property from 2 weeks ago, again, near my home. The crew was painting, nicely physically distancing, working as a team, and when you turned around, you could see they were wearing masks. Again, a great way to keep the economy moving and enjoy a discount. Now, of course, this kind of work probably doesn't count as an emergency repair, so that's why we have attorney Adrian Adams here on the program today. Don't violate any lockdown orders, but if you can do property maintenance, painting is a great thing to move forward with, and there's a good chance you can enjoy some favorable pricing. And another one here, another property close to my home, resurfacing their asphalt. This is a commercial building, so with no one working, the parking lot was empty, offering a great time to resurface their parking lot. This project is certainly a whole lot easier to do when employees aren't stirring, and it may be great for your association when people aren't stirring back and forth. And again, I bet they got some favorable pricing. So let's look at some numbers. This shows another association we were working with where we were helping them with their cash flow. And notice the first 2 years, reserve expenses of a little over $200,000 in each of those first 2 years. Now the numbers were that they had some window replace and recaulking projects on their schedule, and they informed us that after talking with the service provider, they found out if they launched the project now, again, rather than waiting till summertime or fall, they could enjoy a 10% savings. The crews were idle, they had time, they had already ordered the materials, so the association went ahead and did the project, saving the association just over $24,000. Now that's not a night and day difference to this association, but by doing the project now rather than later this year when, crossing my fingers, hopefully things are more back to normal, that was a nice chunk of cash to save. And it's the kind of cash you don't have to repay. So just able to move forward. They saved a bunch of cash and kept a valuable service provider busy. Now, before I turn it back to Adrian, I want to talk about the tool I've used to create the charts for this webinar. In 2019, we launched UPlanet. It's a free online reserve calculator that all our professional reserve study clients have been enjoying. It's right next to their completed reserve study documents that they find when they log into their account at www.reservestudy.com. With UPlanet, our clients can access their component list and funding plan information so they can do their own what-if testing. It's a great way boards can push around some numbers like I've shown in today's program. All our clients have access to it free of charge during their budget planning season, and all the calculations and the presentation results are based on National Reserve Study standards. And I will shoot a little 2 or 3 minute video and have that on the online summary and notes that you can look at. A nice little summary to show how it works and what I was able to do. And the point I want to make is that while it's free to all our professional reserve study clients, in June we'll be rolling it out as a product available to any interested association for just $149 a year. We think it's the right thing to do to make it available. We figure a lot of associations are out there looking for a way to test their numbers and push things around. And again, all National Reserve Study standard concepts and outputs.
Okay, going back again to the business judgment rule, we know that the crisis is going to be temporary. We know that from the poll that you took at the beginning, 22% are experiencing it. The cash flow problems, the delinquencies, and another 50% are expecting that they will. And we know that the coronavirus is could possibly mutate, go up, reappear in the fall. So this thing could extend into next year with impacting the economy. And so what boards need are tools in order to deal with reduced cash flows. And this is one of them, in using the reserves to get there. But it's important, in order to protect themselves as directors, that they properly go through the process of the due diligence. The good faith part doesn't bother me. The best interest part, I know is going to be there. It's the due diligence and documentation and then communication. So it's really important for them, in order to have backup for the decisions that they're making, in order to document those into the minutes, and then to communicate what they're doing to the membership, because members don't like surprises. The membership, if they're kept apprised of what's going on, they're remarkably resilient on being able to absorb bad news. And as long as they know that the board is moving along in the right direction, being reasonable and responsible, they're generally on board with what the board is doing. So let's go to the next slide. So in the using of reserves, as Robert talked about it, you've got the 3 different steps in order, the types of reserves that you can use. And so what do you do before you get there? You can see here, assembling the information, doing your homework, reviewing your budget, making sure that you're taking care of your collections, working with legal counsel, and then you get to the step, if you need to, of using your reserves. And so identifying what you need to do, conserving the cash for your reserves, which means pushing projects, delaying them if you need to, borrowing from your reserves by either reducing your allocations, or stopping them temporarily, or actually taking money from reserves, and then saving cash by getting projects done less expensively. So those are all 3 things that you can do. And then finally, make sure you document, so that you've got paper trails showing that you're doing your due diligence, you're following the business judgment rule. So Robert, I'll let you take it from here.
Fantastic. Well, thanks, Adrian. We've been sharing ideas because we want your association to thrive. This pandemic came upon us so quickly that, fortunately, boards have an opportunity to plan ahead, figuring out their options and preparing to make wise decisions in advance of rising delinquencies. We heard many of you are anticipating rising delinquencies. We don't want you to make foolish decisions that are going to come back and bite you. So we'll end with a brief acknowledgement to both our companies. Adams-Stirling is a prominent law firm serving California associations, but as you heard, they have a newsletter that influences boards all across the country. And Association Reserves is a national reserve study company. In addition to preparing reserve studies, we regularly present webinars like this one on reserve study and reserve study related topics. Our next one in early June is going to be the public launch of UPlanet. From our website, www.reservestudy.com, you can request a proposal, see other webinar recordings, or sign up for our email list to make sure you get notifications of upcoming webinars. And with that, I'll turn the microphone over to Paige, who will coordinate our Q&A time. Paige.
Thank you, Robert and Adrian. As I mentioned earlier, you can ask a question by typing your question into the question box at the bottom of your control panel.